Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of Ubiquity University. It's my pleasure with Dr. Georgie Szabo to host this course on the great books, where once a month we gather together for about 90 minutes and we contemplate one of the truly monumental works of human literature. We consider books old and new, east and west, across a spectrum of disciplines and perspectives. We look at books that have influenced human culture, books that have impacted lives, books that have transformed souls and moved armies to march, moved kings and queens to rule, incited riots, led to conversions, but made the intelligence that crafted the book alive in the hearts and minds of men and women across time. We consider today the extraordinary masterpiece that came out of 9th century India, written by Shantideva. This is the second lecture, and just to recall who Shantideva was before we dig into the text and look at some of his great both assumptions and teachings. Shantideva was the son of a king in southern India in the 9th century, and he was the firstborn of the king. And when the king died, the realm prepared a new throne to welcome Shantideva and his coronation. And the night before he was to be coronated, he had a dream. And Manjushri, the great god of wisdom, appeared to him and said, "Shantideva, there's only room for one on the throne. The throne is mine." And Shantideva woke up, and the next morning, so profoundly moved by his dream, he said to his ministers and his courtiers that it was not his throne to take. He left the kingdom, he wandered north and found the great Nalanda University. And the Nalanda University, which was founded in about the 4th century, by the 9th century, was at its apex, where tens of thousands of Buddhist monks and scholars from all over Asia and the Middle East would come together and study everything from astronomy to medicine to art to architecture to spirituality. And there, Shantideva remained anonymous. His schoolmates wondered and thought maybe he was a dullard because he didn't speak so good and he didn't do hardly anything in his classes. He kind of just wandered around. And so they decided to lay a trap for him and compel him to speak before the assembled monks. Great dais was constructed, and he spent several days in seclusion. And on the appointed day, he arose and took his seat on the dais and proceeded to utter, to recite what has come down to us as the way of the Bodhisattva. And as he finished his oration, an apparition of Manjushri appeared behind him, and Shantideva and Manjushri ascended and disappeared into thin air. and he was never seen again in Nalanda. They searched far and wide. There were tales of him appearing in South India again, stories of great miracles, feeding vast multitudes of hungry people, protecting kings and queens from evil deities. And what we now know as the way of the Bodhisattva was codified very quickly, similar to the Quran. Some works, like the Bible, are constructed over centuries and centuries and centuries. The way of the Bodhisattva is clearly the oration, the creation of a single mind. And the text that we'll consider today came directly as a transmission from Shantideva to the students of Nalanda, and has been preciously preserved, largely through the Tibetan Buddhist tradition until the present day, although the oldest text was in Sanskrit. So what I would like to do today is delve into the text, but I want to do it from the framework of modern research on the human formation of disease. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. And then when I'm finished, I'll have Georgie, who's a very much more deeply knowledgeable Buddhist scholar than certainly I am, to respond, and then we'll open it up to the students for the balance of our times. But I want to start with the way the Dalai Lama in the foreword speaks of the way of the Bodhisattva, because the Dalai Lama has said that this work has taught him more about compassion than any other teacher. That's a very strong statement, but that underscores the point that we make every year about great books. When you pick up a book, you're not picking up an inanimate object. It may feel inanimate, but it carries an intelligence that is not your own. And when you would read the words, you're being addressed by an intelligence that is not your own. And the Dalai Lama says that the principal focus of the Mahayana teachings, of which Shantideva's work is an exemplification, is on cultivating a mind wishing to benefit other sentient beings. With an increase in our own sense of peace and happiness, we will naturally be better able to contribute to the peace and happiness of others. Transforming the mind and cultivating a positive, altruistic, and responsible attitude are beneficial right now. Whatever problems and difficulties we may have, we can thereby face them with courage, calmness, and high spirits. Therefore, it is also the very root of happiness for many lives to come. So what constitutes the way of the Bodhisattva is the cultivation of what Shantideva calls Bodhichitta. Bodhi means awakened, Chitta means mind, the awakened mind. And I want to begin with that because grasping this truth out of the ignorance within which most of us spend most of our lives is actually a miracle. Remember Plato's allegory of the cave. We're all looking at the back of the cave. We see the shadows on the back of the cave, and we think they're real. That's samsara in the Buddhist tradition. What causes us to wake up? Plato says it's from an external source. Shantideva doesn't really answer the question, but what he says is whatever it is that wakes you up to the fact that the cave and the shadows aren't the reality, that the sun outside is the reality, and you've got to get up, turn around, and go to the mouth of the cave. Whatever that catalytic agent is more precious than gold. And he has a beautiful line in the first chapter where he talks about, "For I am like a blind man who has found a precious gem inside a heap of dust. For so it is, by some strange chance, that Bodhichitta has been born in me." This is the supreme draught of immortality that slays the Lord of death, the slaughterer of beings, the rich, unfailing treasure, mine to heal the poverty of wanderers. It is the sovereign remedy that perfectly allays all maladies. It is the tree that gives relief to those who wander wearily the pathways of existence. Bodhichitta is the universal bridge that saves all wandering beings from the states of loss, the rising moon of the enlightened mind that soothes the sorrows born of afflictions. The problem, says Shantideva, is that even though we awaken to the possibility of awakened mind, we have a very long way to go. And it's about traversing the pathway from awakening to enlightenment that comprises the chapter formation of the way of the Bodhisattva. This is the way that one becomes more and more about what one truly is. And that is an awakened mind that is dedicated ever more deeply to the redemption of all living beings. But he says, what we discover is that I am as if benumbed by sorcery, as if reduced to total mindlessness. I do not know what dulls my wits, or what is it that has me in its grip. Anger, lust, these enemies of mine. Anger and lust, passions of the mind, passions of the body. That's the key for Shantideva, is understanding that the great enemies lie within, and they're the passions of the emotions, anger, greed, delusion, and the lust of the flesh, sexuality, erotica, the body. These enemies of mine, they're limbless and devoid of faculties. They have no bravery, no cleverness. How then have they reduced me to such slavery? Anger has no body. Lust has no arms or legs. They're not even corporeal. And yet they drive our corporeality like a master drives a slave. They cause every manner of addiction. They turn us against each other, and they turn us against ourselves. They dwell within my mind, and at their pleasure they injure me. All this I suffer meekly, unresenting. We actually love it. We give way to it, even though we know it's taking us away from that which we most truly are. We know the sun is out at the mouth of the cave, but most of us prefer looking at the shadows at the back of the cave. And as Plato reminds us, the shackles that bind us to our seats aren't put on by anybody else but us. So this is the conundrum with which Shantideva is wrestling. The possibility of enlightenment, the reality of enslavement to what he calls defiled emotions. He has one other comment here. Because in addition to defiled emotions, he also talks about women. And for the bhikshu, for the monks, women in many ways are the personification of everything that must be avoided. And he talks about staying away from women. And if you, as a monk, have to tutor a woman, make sure that she's accompanied by a man. And do not travel, do not sit, do not ever stay alone with a woman of another house. You might be able to do it with your sister or with your mother. But when you deal with a woman as a woman, what gets incited in you is your passion and your lust. And that leads him in the 4th chapter to really go much more deeply and say that however great may be their peril, people will by reflex guard their eyes. And likewise I, whatever dangers come, must not fall down beneath defilement's power. Better for me to be burned to death, and better to be killed, my head cut off. At no time will I bow and scrape before that foe of mine, defiled emotions. Thus in every time and place I will not wander from the wholesome path. Like those who take pleasure in their games, whatever task the Bodhisattvas do, let them devote themselves without reserve, with joyfulness that never knows satiation, and through hard labor, gain enlightenment. And what this means, he says, is that you have to leave community. It's like Sartre said, hell is other people. And for Shantideva, just dealing with other people incites our passions. We don't get along with other people. We get mad at other people. We hate other people. They hate us. There's all kinds of bad karma that happens when you're with other people. So you leave. When shall I depart to make my home in cave or empty shrine or under spreading tree? Within my breast, free, unfettered heart, which never turns to cast a backward glance. When might I abide in such a place unclaimed and ownerless, that's wide and unconfined, a place where I might stay at liberty without attachment? When might I be free of fear without the need to hide from anyone, with just a begging bowl and a few belongings, dressed in garments coveted by none, and going to the charnel ground, the place of the burial, the corpses? When shall I compare my body with dry bones there, so soon to fall to nothing, all of like? This form of mine, this very flesh, is soon to give out such a stench that even jackals won't come close, and that indeed is all it will become. This body, now so whole and integral, this flesh and bone that life has knit together, will drift apart, disintegrate, and how much more will friend depart from friend? Remember the Buddha sitting in the burial grounds. The Tibetan Buddhists do this on a regular basis as part of their training. Go visit the land of the corpse and realize that you too, one day, are going to become a corpse. And in the face of your death, in the face of the stench that you will become, what is true? What is important? What is of eternal value? It's the enlightened mind. That is what is eternal. And all the passions, all the lust, all the physical aspects will pass away. And as Plato said, which Shantideva would affirm, all philosophy begins with a meditation on death. And so it is the negation of our passions that are, and our lust, our bodies, in solitude, that Shantideva holds up as the paragon of the Bodhisattva, who by the time of the Mahayana tradition, even though he was sculpted in solitude, was dedicated to not entering in nirvana until the very last soul, any sentient being anywhere, was also invited into nirvana. And you take the vow that you will be the last conscious being that enters into that blissful realm. So that's the classic understanding, the best of my knowledge, based on the reading of this text. And what I want to now do is turn to modern psychoneuroimmunology and ask the question of Shantideva. Is anger really the enemy? Can anger actually be the pathway of redemption? Is sexuality to be negated? Or is sexuality an integral part of wholeness? The fact that we will die doesn't mean that we should not live. And it's within this context, as I requested of our doctoral students last time, that they look at Gabor Mate's work, When the Body Says No. I've been reading this book and rereading it. It's been impacting my life very powerfully. In this work, Gabor Mate really enabled me to look at my emotions in a completely different way. Because Gabor Mate says that the very cultivation that Shantideva is asking us to nurture is the source of our disease. And I want to just offer us for a few minutes today this juxtaposition between modern psychoneuroimmunology, endocrinology, and the role that emotions play in both disease and health. And we don't have very much time, so I'm going to move through this quite quickly. But I want to just deal with the one passion of anger. And read you something that Gabor Mate says toward the end of his work. And first of all, he makes the quip reciting Woody Allen. "I never get angry," Woody Allen once said. "I grow a tumor instead." And I want you to just stop for a moment and think about what that means. I don't get angry. I just grow a tumor instead. Not only does the repression of anger, says Gabor Mate, predispose a person to disease, but the experience of anger has been shown to promote healing, or at least to prolong survival. People with cancer who have been able to muster anger at their physicians, for example, live longer than do their more placid and repressed counterparts. In animal experiments, the expression of anger has been found to be less physiologically stressful than the suppression of anger. In rats who fight others when caged together, slower growth of tumors have been found than in more docile animals. Now, he has a whole book on this. But what he details in this work is that when we're children, powerless in our family, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, and we express anger, what do our parents tell us? Oh, Jimmy, don't be angry now. Don't cry. And so we learn over time to express the emotions that, if we would express them, would give us a pathway to healing. So I'm wanting to challenge Shantideva's basic notion around defiled emotions, and whether in fact it's the repression of our defilement of emotions, our repression of our natural urges towards sexuality, that is in fact the cause of disease. And if you read his work, When the Body Says No, they can predict a range of diseases with 80 to 90% accuracy just by looking at the psycho-emotional profile of the patients. And for example, women who have breast cancer, according to Gabor Mate and all the research, are women largely who aren't dealing with their anger. And I don't have time today to get into the particulars of it, but I recommend this work to everyone to read in juxtaposition to Shantideva's work, because it is really arresting. But just to continue with the emotion of anger, that the suppression of anger may have negative consequences, but should we encourage its expression anyway, even if it harms others? Think about that. If you express your anger, you're going to upset people. If you don't express your anger, you're going to damage yourself. Now, there's no particular way to answer this question. I'm just raising it for you students after Georgie finishes. I'd like to get into this. I want to get into this whole issue. For example, Mate says that if you get too angry and you go into a rage, heart attacks can often follow, particularly with men, if they experience true rage. So that the relationship between rage and cardiovascular disease is also a function of the psychoneuroimmune apparatus. The sympathetic nerves are activated in rage states. Narrowing of the blood vessels occur with excessive sympathetic fight or flight activity, increasing the blood pressure and decreasing oxygen supply to the heart. The hormones secreted during the stress responses in rage states raise lipid levels, including the serum cholesterol. They also activate clotting mechanisms, further heightening the risk of blockages in the arteries. How then to resolve the dilemma of anger? If the expression of anger is harmful, and so is its repression, how do we hope to attain health and healing? The repression of anger and the unregulated acting out of it are both examples of the abnormal release of emotions that is at the root of disease. Both repression and rage represent a fear of the genuine experience of anger. Healthy anger is an empowerment and a relaxation. The real experience of anger is a physiologic experience which expresses our internal state without acting out. The experience is one of a surge of power going through the system, along with a mobilization to attack. There is simultaneously a complete disappearance of all anxiety. Now just think about that for a moment. Ask yourself the question. We all know that we've repressed anger. Everybody has been taught to repress anger. We've all probably experienced rage when we just go out of control, where the anger just explodes out of us without restraint. Have any of us experienced real anger? Anger that relaxes us? Anger that empowers us without violating boundaries? I ask you to contemplate that, because that is healing. There's a distinction that we won't go into today, but the distinction that he makes between anger and rage. But since anger leads to an attacking energy, says Mate, it threatens attachment. Thus, there is something basically anxiety-provoking about the anger experience, even without external parental injunctions against anger expression. Aggressive impulses are suppressed because of guilt, and the guilt exists only because of the simultaneous existence of love, of positive feelings. So anger doesn't exist in a vacuum by itself. It is incredibly anxiety-provoking and guilt-producing for a person to experience aggressive feelings toward a loved one, even though expressing it is the healthiest thing they can do in that moment. To conclude, anger is the energy Mother Nature gives us as little kids to stand forward on our own behalf and say, I matter. I matter. The difference between the healthy energy of anger and the hurtful energy of emotional and physical violence is that anger respects boundaries. Standing forward on your own behalf does not invade anybody else's boundaries, even though it may seem at the time that the mere expression of your sense of self will challenge another person to respond. In light of these new experiences and therapeutic understandings about anger, circle back to Shantideva. Is anger always a defiled emotion? How do we work with anger in a way that is therapeutic? And I know, and probably Georgie's going to note the number of wrathful deities in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. So I want to just put that on the table. And I want to then turn to another contemporary author to raise a final point that to me is taking what Gabor Mate has expounded about how an individual deals with anger and stress to the next level, a level that I'm not sure Shantideva knew about, because in the 21st century, we're just finding out about. And this is a book by Mark Wolin. It Didn't Start With You. And he's been doing research on cross-generational trauma, something that is increasingly preoccupying my thoughts, particularly given our relationship with Thomas Hubel, who really deeply works with cross-generational trauma. When you get angry, when I get angry, that experience immediately affects our bodies, our psyche, our neural system, our immune system, our endocrine system. That effect is passed in me through my sperm and through a woman through her egg. So every time you experience a feeling, it's changing your body chemistry and moving into the next generation and shaping those unborn generations down the road. So what that means is sometimes when you're expressing anger, you're not expressing your anger. You're expressing the anger of your grandfather. What would Shantideva say about that? That it's not just you we're dealing with here. We're dealing with generations before you who have passed down their anger and the responses to stress and the responses to life in the genetic code that is shaping who you are. Now, just to make this real, because this is a big thought, I want to just refer to some mice research, because in a few paragraphs, you're going to get the profundity of what we're dealing with here. And, you know, they're doing a lot of studies with mice because mice and humans have about a 99 point something overlap in their genetics, right? So when you do a mouse, you're doing a human for all practical purposes. But because mice live sometimes for only 6 weeks or a few months, you can get their life cycles within a couple years, whereas for humans, it takes centuries to get the same cross-generational data. Let me read you this experiment. And remember, this pertains to humans. And always remember, we're dealing with Shantideva. How do we gain enlightenment? Is going into the forest and leaving it all behind really the way? Is it even possible to get outside of ourselves? The mice in one generation were trained to fear a cherry blossom like scent. Each time they were exposed to the smell, they simultaneously received an electric shock. After a while, the shocked mice had a greater amount of smell receptors associated with that particular scent, enabling them to detect it at increasingly lower concentrations. They also had enlarged brain areas devoted to those receptors. Researchers were also able to identify changes in the mice's sperm. Now, first of all, I want you to think about what you've been taught about evolution. It's all random, and there's genetic mutations, and it takes a long time. No way, Jose. Evolution is instant. You get a stimulus, you respond, it's embedded in the genetic code like that. Darwin was only half correct. It's also true that there's genetic mutations, but Lamarck was closer to the mark, that you pass down what you know. Now, the most intriguing aspect of the study is what occurred in the next 2 generations. Both the pups and the grandpups, when exposed to the blossom order, became jumpy and avoided it, despite never having experienced before and receiving no electric shocks. So whatever was transmitted in the sperm, and we'll see in a minute, the eggs, the next generation was hypersensitive to the blossom, and even without shocks would react against it. Now think about that. You may have all of a sudden been allergic to something when you were a child. You have no idea why you're allergic to carrots or to a smell. It probably had nothing to do with you. It had to do with your mother or your grandmother or your grandfather, and it's been passed down. There's something in the sperm, according to one of the researchers, that is informing or allowing the information to be inherited. The exact mechanisms for how a parent's traumatic experience gets stored in the DNA is still under investigation. It's called transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. And the author asked the questions. He says, I often see recurring patterns of illness, depression, anxiety, relationship struggles, and financial hardships, and always feel compelled to look deeper. What unexplored event in a previous generation drives the behavior of a man who loses all his money at the racetrack, or the woman who chooses to be intimate only with married men? How have their genetic inheritances been influenced? And the whole book is about, when you have a problem, if you start looking at the generations before you, you'll find that many of your patterns have been inherited over time. And they're beginning to find out it's not just in the morphogenic field, it's in the sperm and the egg that you inherit with such exactitude that traumas past you replicate in your own life almost involuntarily. They also found out that several of the rats were exposed to very minor stresses, such as changes in temperature as early as 45 days after they were born, which is the equivalent of being an adolescent in human terms. And remarkably, the effects were measurable in the next generation. Focusing on one single gene, which encodes a molecule involved in the body's responses to stress, the researchers detected increased amounts of the molecular product of this gene in the brains of the stressed female rats. They also discovered significantly increased concentrations of the same molecular product in the eggs of stressed females, and also in the brains of the offspring, demonstrating that information about the stress experience is not only passed through the sperm, it's passed through the egg. But that altered behavior in the newborn rats is unrelated to the type of parenting the pups received from their mothers, which means, he says, that siblings born of the same parents may inherit different traumas and lead contrasting lives despite sharing a similar upbringing. They've done these studies of Siamese twins, exact same genetic code. They turn out completely different personalities. And what's important about this study, and with this I'll close, is that you inherit this gene, and even if your mother loves you and caresses you and nurtures you in the most perfect way possible, the stresses that have come down through your DNA, through what Rupert Sheldrake calls the morphogenetic field, surface and manifest themselves, even to replicating great traumas and great crimes even that come out of your familial past. So again, Shantideva, we know that enlightenment is possible. The traumas, the depressions, the sufferings we're born with, we live in, that come to us over time and are part of just who we are. That's what puts us in the cave. That's what binds us to our illusions, to samsara. And somehow we wake up. Somehow we come to an awareness that there's another way. Is Shantideva right? Do we vanquish defiled emotions? Do we put the other sex out of our mind and view? Do we go into the forest and into solitude? Or do we, as Nietzsche would suggest, embrace the body, embrace our passions, embrace our creatureliness, and create a new way of being in the world that is around play, around laughter, around exuberance, where the very things that Shantideva is telling us to repress, we actually celebrate and bring in creatively a new order of being. That's the discussion I would like to have with all of you today. And on that note, I will thank you and turn it over to my distinguished colleague from Budapest, Dr. Szabo.
Oh, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. What a brilliant, amazing, rich presentation. Another one. Holy Shantideva. Well, I'd like to divide my comments into two. First is that because I wasn't present at the last time, I'd like to say a few words about what I feel and think about this book, and then to really reflect on your amazing lecture today. But just before going there, I started to write down how many questions you had, and after like half an hour, I lost track. So in order to answer it all, we would have another 3 hours or so, if not longer, but really rich. I loved it. Thank you. So first, I'd like to say that to me, the way of the Bodhisattva is a spiritual autobiography, because the text is so personal in tone. It is not philosophical, and it is not very analytic. So it's not dry like most of the Buddhist theoretical books. Shantideva is very, his personality comes through. He shares with us his struggles, his doubts about the becoming and being a bodhisattva, and his joy as well, because he feels that his bodhisattva vow gives him a very strong self-esteem and courage. So somehow, in a very brilliant way, he humanizes the doctrines and teachings. Now, there are so many things I love about his verses. One aspect I adore about Shantideva, that how great gift he has about metaphors and the imaginary. This way he conveys the very strict Buddhist ideas. So two things I'd like to say, and I need to bring up my notes here if you don't mind. First, he talks about the mind is like a house. Mindfulness is like doors and windows of the house, like a guardian. And mindfulness is able to detect the threat to security of the house, the thieves of unawareness, and the lapses of mindfulness. Thieves break in the house and steal the treasures. Like in meditation, worry gets in like thieves, and just like anger and hatred as well. The other metaphor I love so much is when he talks about that life is like a single organism. If a hand reaches out a painful foot, why don't I reach out to a suffering person? This is universal empathy, isn't it? It can't be an I without being the we, the she, the he, and the it. Recognize the interbeing, the interconnectedness of life is the foundation for a natural and spontaneous caring, exchanging self for another. All these and more he talks about. And there's so many verses I love in this book, and one of which is actually in the chapter 3, which is about taking hold of bodhicitta. And apparently, this chapter is the Dalai Lama's favorite. But I noted some things about bodhicitta that I'd like to share with you. So this is what I thought. The bodhicitta is the altruistic resolve to attain awakening for the benefit of all beings. This is the prime motive for someone who becomes the bodhisattva. Bodhicitta is the soul of the awakening, emanates in the bodhisattva. And if you allow me, I'd like to just read some of my really, really favorite verses, because they really just warm my soul and heart. For all those ailing in the world, until their every sickness has been healed, may I myself become for them the doctor, nurse, the medicine itself. Raining down a flood of food and drink, may I dispel the ears of thirst and famine. And in the eons marked by scarcity and want, may I myself appear as drink and sustenance. For sentient beings, poor and destitute, may I become a treasure ever plentiful and lie before them closely in the reach, a varied source of all that they might need. My body thus and all my good besides, and all my merits gained and to be gained, I give them all and do not count the cost to bring about the benefit of beings. Nirvana is attained by giving all. Nirvana is the object of my striving, and all must be surrendered in a single instant. Therefore, it is best to give it all to others. All those who slight me to my face, or do to me some other evil, even if they blame or slander me, may they attain the fortune of enlightenment. May I be a guard for those who are protectorless, a guide for those who journey on the road, for those who wish to cross the water. May I be a boat, a raft, a bridge. May I be an eye for those who yearn for land, a lamp for those who long for light, for all who need a resting place, a bed, for those who need a servant. May I be their slave. Oh, this is just amazing. But now, some things about anger. So, Gabor Mate, the addiction specialist, another brilliant Hungarian, by the way, he was born in Hungary, but was grown up in Canada. I learned so much from him, especially about addiction, whether it is, drugs or alcohol or cigarettes, is all to do with woundedness. But let's just segue back to your points, Jim, that how anger is destructive, says Shantideva. Anger can be very constructive. I do agree with you. When I am angry, instantly I realize that what really is going on within me. That is like an instant mirror to me. And as you rightly say, it may not be to do with me, my anger, but I will reflect on it a little bit later. What you were saying about the suppression of anger, in energy healing, we recognize that the anger mostly is stored in the liver. apart from all those other organs where the emotional connections are stored. And for that, you can read Louise Hay's wonderful book on this subject. Then that you brought up another question about, can anger be expressed without hurting others? Well, I think it can be. I try to release my anger when I'm on my own, and having hot paprika in my blood, I usually swear. And then I realize, oops, what's really, really going on in me? And another reflection on the genetic code and all the researchers you cited, I would just say in one little note that that's individual karma affecting collective karma. And we could even dedicate another discussion on this, but I would just leave it to our wonderful participants to contribute, because there's so much to talk about. Thank you, Jim. And thank you again for getting this book to me. Thank you so much. You know, you bought it for me many, many years ago, and The Way of the White Clouds. These are my favorite books. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgie. By the way, just a quick question to you, since you've been studying these matters very deeply. What would be your comment from the Tibetan Buddhist point of view in terms of the wrathful deities?
Right. Well, I can comment on the Tibetan Buddhist practices, and they really consider the 11 different words, and they are the so-called nagas, you know, these deities which can be harmful if they are not befriended. And for that, there are several practices Buddhist practitioners practice constantly. Wherever, if you move to a new place, if you actually visit a forest, you know, you don't sit down at a tree or do anything naughty at a tree before really befriending the resident nagas. And there are nagas in the waterways, and there are nagas in the forest and the mountains and basically everywhere. So they are recognized as forceful beings, and they can affect you, influence you badly, unless you actually notice that you haven't done your practices to befriend and to please these nagas, and then they can actually remain peaceful. So in a short, that's what I would say. We do a lot of practices in that regard, the Buddhist community where I go, and they're really, really important. For example, we had a very meaningful practice just a few days ago, and our Lama was telling us that when you really feel agitated, when you feel that nothing is really working for you, that everything is going astray, and you almost feel you are manipulated, this is actually the time when you need to get down to your practices, be that a prostration, be that just, you know, chanting 108 times the Om mantra, or similar mantras that could help put these nagas at peace, because they can actually affect your health. And so the Tibetan Buddhism recognizes these nagas are very forceful and potent energies and entities.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. To be continued. Okay, I want to turn to the students here. I'd like each one of you to raise your hand. I see John Jeanette. John, always good to see you. Looking forward to John joining Georgie and I for our doctoral writing class in a couple of weeks here in Chartres, where I am right now, actually. I've been in Chartres for the last couple of days, and very, very good to be here. We have a number of our courses coming up, Astronomica, our liberal arts course, and Georgie will be doing a doctoral writing course the first week of July. So John, welcome. Look forward to your comments today.
Thank you. Can you see me and hear me?
Can hear you. I can't see you quite yet.
All right. It says
that your voice is clear. Go ahead.
It says the video is working, but I'll just go ahead, because I wanted to talk about something you said right in the beginning, where you said that a book is not an inanimate object. I had a physiological reaction to the Gabor Mate book right at the point that you were talking about with anger. And I want to say it in my own way to see if I'm getting it, because if I have time here, I also want to bring in David Bone's book on dialogue where he talks about suspension. It's very similar. What I picked up from Gabor Mate is that anger is not a defiled emotion. Here's the tweak to the Bodhisattva, is it's not anger that's the defiled emotion. It's the abnormal release of anger. And it's two, and this is the part I think we don't get, is that we know that rage is not necessarily a healthy response. So we think the opposite response is suppression. But as David Bohm points out, suppression is rage against the self. It's still rage, because you're thinking, I can't have this violent reaction. Well, now you're still thinking violent thoughts. So the abnormal release comes out in two ways. Both rage and suppression are unhealthy. Yeah. So what we need to vanquish is not anger, because as Mate says, if we accept anger, we can do it in a very relaxed state. It is physiological, but it isn't acting out of rage. It's a kind of a relaxed acceptance of anger, and this is just profound to me. I had to set the book down and walk around for a while, because it just blew my mind that getting back to the Bodhisattva thinking we must vanquish anger, that I just want to suggest that what we need to vanquish is the abnormal response to anger, not the anger itself. And that is something we have to, if we've inherited this for generations, we're not going to unlearn it in a day or two.
Exactly. Well, let me ask you, John, given this distinction between abnormal projection of anger as rage and the suppression of anger, have you ever had an experience of healthy anger? Yes.
Probably last night for the first time.
Oh, good.
After I read Mate, I allowed myself to be furious.
Oh, good.
About a whole inventory of things that I've been thinking I've been doing a good job of suppressing, and plus I have all kinds of muscle tension. I see a rheumatologist, I stretch, I take hot bath, and I'm thinking, well, I don't know. That's why I'm trying to, I had a physiological reaction that when you release it, when you just accept it, it's much, much different than holding it in, which we think is the only option compared to rage. But it's not, it's just as bad. So now I'm curious about the generational, whose anger I'm holding besides my own. I've got some ideas there. But the acceptance of it is a radical notion to me.
Yeah.
And I think for me, if what I've been feeling in the last 24 hours is any indication, it's utterly transformative.
That is fantastic. I am so happy to hear that, because I've been having the same kind of experience. And one of the great things about Mark Wolin's book, It Didn't Start With You, is that he gives a whole bunch of exercises that you can do as you really connect back with your parents and your grandparents and beyond. And it's less important that they're physically in front of you, although those of you who have parents still alive, I would urge you as strongly as I possibly can to read Mark Wolin's book and spend time with your parents in a heartful way, seeking to understand this cross-generational trauma. It could not be more important to your well-being and to your sense of of health and comfortability about who you are. So I'm very gratified, John, that you had such a deeply visceral reaction, because that means you and I share the same response to the work, which means we got a lot of work to do, brother.
I almost raised my hand during your introductory remarks because I was feeling it so strongly. But I'd like to add one more thing and then pass it on to other students for comments. The question then is, how do we understand, how do we get into this relaxed state of acceptance? And one person that might help is Jack Cornfield. And I'll share this in the comments afterward, when we post after the webinar. It's a Zencast. He talks about the Bodhisattva. It happens to be Zencast number 342 from the Insight Meditation Center in Redwood, California. And he talks about short-term and long-term work. You talked about the kind of work that we need to do, the hard labor of enlightenment. And he talks about tuning into our best intention as the short-term process. The long-term process, of course, being the Bodhisattva vow, which seems far beyond my capabilities at the moment, but the short-term work of tuning into our best intention before we respond in any way to anything may be our way of getting to that state of relaxed acceptance of anger that allows us to experience it and express it physiologically without it being defiled by rage or suppression. Thank you for letting me share my enthusiasm about this discovery.
Well, yes, we'll turn to Vivian in a moment, but I want to just comment on what you're saying, because Gabor Mate has a whole chapter on the power of negative thinking. And he cautions against premature positive thinking, because he says that's what causes us to create this overlay in our persona as the friendly, totally understanding, working for everybody's good, so that we manifest a bodhisattva persona and behavior. But because we haven't done the real work inside, that behavior is constructed at the cost of the suppression of emotions. And in fact, if you've seen any of the lectures of Gabor Mate, he reads a number of obituaries. She was such a nice woman. Not once did I ever hear her or hear about her ever displaying anger or saying anything unkind to anyone. And she dies of, a horrendous disease. And so part of the therapeutic process that both Mark Wolin and Gabor Mate are talking about is actually, before we get to the right intentions, to come to terms with those aspects of ourselves that we are conditioned to repress. And it's very hard for us to do that because our conditioning our whole lives is those are wrong, those are bad. And so he talks about what he calls the power of negative thinking, and says that wrongful positive thinking is actually what kills us. So you're going to find this work very, very challenging and very rewarding, I'm sure, like John and I have, all of you who have not yet read it. But thank you, John. Look forward to talking a lot more about this when we're together in Chartres. Chartres is the perfect place to have late night meals and drinks for these kinds of discussions. But let's turn to Vivian. Vivian, what would you like to say? And then we may have enough time for one more student if you want. Any other students want to raise their hands? Hi, Vivian.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. You look very pink-cheeked today.
I had a reaction to kava, but anyway, I was trying to relax, right? So that was last Sunday, actually. So I've had this for a week. But anyway, very interesting topic. So the chapter in the book, and I'll get to the anger part, but the chapter in the book that was most just struck me to the core was the one on diligence, because I find that I give up too easily on things. So and it's specifically around anger. So it's so weird that you started this today with the anger thing, because I just passed my security clearance. I work for the National Institute of Health, and I've been there for 4 months, and I had to go through a process of why, and explain why I had an incident that resulted in me kicking somebody in the groin in public. So without getting into too much of it, I'm going to post it because I just had to write all this down. So I was the Democratic Party chairman kicking one of my colleagues that attacked me at the polling place, calling me names and physically attacking me. So the Democratic Party chairman for Stokes County kicked a teabagger in the tea bags, basically was the headline in the newspaper. So I know we're recording this, but I just had to explain this to the National Institute of Health about why. So I've been to therapy on this. Why did this manifest itself with me so strongly, and how have I tempered it? So I do have a temper. I have the opposite problem of what you're talking about. I will say my mind at the moment's notice, but that of a caring community leader does not need to do that so readily. I need to hold my tongue and my foot, obviously. But all charges were dropped and everything's copacetic with it. But it's just, it was just very interesting that you brought that up. So I actually have a traumatic experience intergenerationally. My father was court-martialed from the military for fighting at 18 years of service. So I've been talking to people about this. I don't fight. I'm a peace-loving activist. But I did have an incident where somebody attacked me physically, and I had witnesses and stuff that he deserved what he got, but still I'm a peace activist. So it was very traumatic for me and for my community for that to occur. So, I guess the thing that I persevered trying to understand where this anger comes from and what it was manifest by. But I live in a very red community, and I'm the Democratic Party chairman. So it's it's just weird that God put me in a situation such as this, so that I do have to deal with my anger in a constructive way, and I have over the past 4 years. This happened in 2014, so I have, and today was just like to have my clearance, I had to be interviewed and discuss this in great detail, what happened and what I have done over the past 5 years to mitigate this. It was very, very powerful to me. And that you brought this up today it's bizarre to me, actually. But anyway, I think that the Bodhichitta that I want to bring into my life now is to persevere through this manifestation of anger in myself. So it's just perfect timing.
Let me ask you, Vivian, given your experience and given what you've just said about anger, how would you define for yourself correct anger? I mean, and aside from how the newspapers wrote it up and what you had to say to the Institute and so forth, was your experience at the time that this was an appropriate? Because what Gabor Mate says is that the healthy anger sets the boundary?
So
And
I'm
it may
a
be that
folk
you
I'm a folk
traverse the
hero in my
boundary, but you
community.
may have been just setting it.
So I'm a folk hero in my community, right? With the Democrats, I'm a folk hero. So it's very much a line, you know, he got what he deserved, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, it was embarrassment. I embarrassed myself and my community, right? So I feel like I'm very much, you know, I'm 60 years old, so I got some deference because I was a woman, etc. But it was healthy. I was not angry. I really wasn't. I was afraid, and I was defending myself. This person attacked me, but you know, so I wrote up. I will post to the forum what I wrote to the National Institute of Health. It's very, you know, it's not emotional. I'm a, you know, computer programmer. I can go to the left side of my brain. I went to Landmark Forum for this. So the healthy thing that came out of this is that I really did have to study this. What was motivating me to be able to do this, not angrily. Like I said, it's like I really wasn't angry. It was self-defense, but it was written up as if I was just, you know, I went crazy, and I didn't at all. It was self-defense. But the part that came out of it that was very, very sad about it all is, I mean, there was lots of consequences that, and I won't go into it because of it, that happened, that I, you know, had to really go deep and talk to the community to talk about my anger, that I really wasn't anger, that it was self-defense. But it's really difficult. It's a very difficult thing to talk about, that it wasn't anger. It was, but I do have liver issues. So that, you know, that you talked about that it was in the liver. So it's like, and I've been working on that too, like that I have anger about being pigeonholed into that I'm this, you know, this crazy person. And it wasn't that at all. It's very weird. If you let go of that anger, I mean, even if you let go of the physical part, there's a line there that you can't break. And I think that Shantideva is correct in that you have to control it, the physical portion of it. So, you know, I don't know. Like I said, I feel like I still wrestle with it all the time. It's been 5 years.
Yeah, gotcha. Good. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And let's see, is there anybody else that wants to make a comment before we adjourn? Georgie.
Oh, just a quick one. When we were talking about anger, even the Dalai Lama gets angry. So, you know, it's okay. I think that the way he gets angry, he just releases that energy, and quickly he really goes back to that Bodhisattva being of himself, and he just carries on with life. Like he is not hurting others. And also wanted to ask you, who is our commentator in the chat box with the LXB8? Because the messages you're leaving are really intriguing. Thank you very much. I just can't put a name to it.
Yeah.
Amy Blumenstein.
Amy, hello. Do you want to say something?
Amy, are you on a phone, or are you on video? It'd be great for you to comment. We have just enough time for one more comment. No, thanks. She's just wanting to do the chats. But it's good to have your comments, Amy. Your name didn't come through, but you're making some very, very good points.
Maybe she can she get into the forum, Amy?
It's limited to students, I'm afraid, registered students, but okay. That's okay. All of you can see Amy's chats. So I think what we'll do is bring this to a close. Let me just offer one or two final thoughts. And that is that in this particular case, I was honoring Shantideva by asking deep questions about Shantideva. But there's no doubt in my mind and in the mind of anybody who's read this work that he is one of those titans, you know, the giants, as Bernard of Clairvaux says, upon whose shoulders we stand. And so I want to make sure everybody understands that. At the same time, I think that as we learn more about who we are as creatures, as we learn more about the axial traditions, we need to really question any tradition that negates the body, that negates women, that negates nature, that negates our passions. And so while there's great wisdom and truth in all the axial religions, the framing, the very context out of which they came is in some ways life-denying. And we've all paid a very heavy price for that negation of nature, the negation of the body, the negation of women, the negation of the emotions. And so as we read these great works, I think it's important that we juxtapose them with another way of evaluating who we are. And of course, as you all know, that's why I am so impressed with Friedrich Nietzsche, because Nietzsche was the one philosopher that could see clearly that all that stuff, all that negation was detrimental to becoming who we most truly are. And that's why his Thus Sprach Zarathustra is, in my mind, one of the greatest of the great works of the human literature and tradition, because the passions, in his view, need to be embraced. The body, embodiment, earth, laughter, play, joy, dance, and above all, creativity. For Nietzsche, enlightenment is not going into the forest and becoming neutral. Enlightenment is throwing yourself into the fulcrum of life and using every aspect of who you are to create novelty for a better world. And as most of you know, I'm very Nietzschean in the way I live my life and the way we're framing Ubiquity University. So I just wanted to add that. But I wanted to also say before we close, and I want to close with a benediction drawn from Shantideva. Next month, we'll turn our attention to Plutarch and to one of the lives of the great Greeks, Alcibiades, who almost single-handedly destroyed the Athenian Empire and the Athenian democracy. And I want to turn to that story in light of what Trump is doing to the United States and to the world order. Because what we're seeing with Trump, like 75 years ago we saw with Hitler, one person is all it takes to destroy an entire way of life that has been built up over centuries. Make no mistake, the American democracy is as fragile as the Athenian democracy and just as easily destroyed. And as you all know from my various blogs and op-eds, if we do not deal with Trump definitively, the American Republic is going to be forfeit. And so looking at the foil from 2,500 years ago, the story of Alcibiades, drawn from Plutarch, will be the theme of the next great book. But returning to Shantideva, in his final chapter, the dedication, he has some quatrains that are just beautiful beyond beautiful. And with this, I'd like to just close. He talks about the spirit of the Bodhisattva and what you wish for the world, which is the reason why you seek enlightenment. May those caught in the freezing ice be warmed, and from great clouds of bodhisattvas, torrents rain in boundless streams to cool those burning in the infernal fires. May forests where the leaves are blades and swords become sweet groves and pleasant woodland glades. And may the trees of miracles appear, supplanting those upon the hill of Shaumali. And may the very pits of hell be sweet, with fragrant pools all perfumed with the scent of lotuses, and lovely with the cries of swan and goose, and waterfalls so pleasing to the ear. May fiery coals turn into heaps of jewels, the burning ground become an even crystal floor. May crushing hills become sublime abodes, offering temples, dwellings of the Buddhas. May the hail of weapons, lava, fiery stones, become henceforth a rain of flowers, and all the mutual woundings with sharp blades be now a rain of flowers thrown in play. That's for you, Vivian. May the kick to the groin become showers of petals upon that poor fellow's head. In total, bountiful embrace of all that is. And those engulfed in fiery hells, their flesh destroyed, their bones bleached white as kunda flowers, may they, through all my merits, through your merits, Vivian, I dedicate this one to you. May they, through all your merits, strength, have godlike forms and sport with goddesses of Manjushri's peaceful streams. I think that in the end is the message here. However you grapple with what you've done as you've expressed who you are, in the end, the Bodhisattva seeks through himself and herself to create an anvil through which all these emotions are purified as lotus blossoms, and then they just sprinkle down on the heads of everyone we meet. So it's in that spirit I want to offer blessings to the Buddha. I want to offer blessings to all the deities, and blessings on Shantideva, who graced us over the last several months with this great work, The Way of the Bodhisattva. Blessings on us all. And for those of you who are students, we'll talk about this more on the forum page on the Ubiquity platform. Thank you, everyone. We'll talk next month.
Thank you.